Welcome back to another live stream. So it's been a while since the last one. I actually don't know how long it's been. How long has it been since the last one? 2 months, I think, since the we watched the pro-natalist video. Hopefully everything is set up correctly. You can hear me all loud and clear. Let me know in the chat if you can. It's been a while since I set everything up. But I hope everyone is doing well. There's a few people in the chat already, although I think they were here before the stream started. We've got Ding. I'm not going to be able to say the rest of your name, but welcome. Zach, Louis, Shatom, Jezza, Hun, Does, Burning Flex. Yoda is in the chat, or how would Yoda say it? Yoda in the chat I am, or something like that. Void Occupant, welcome everyone to the stream. And if you haven't said hello already, then please do in the chat. We've got Bovine Blue Stocking as usual. We've got Money. I hope everyone is doing all good. So, like I said, there hasn't been a stream in a while. That has been for a range of reasons. I've just been very busy. And actually, I think that's the main reason. But one thing I want to say straight off the bat is, I'd been thinking of reacting to, or wanting to react to this one for a while, because I watched it, I think when it first came out, or a while ago anyway, and I remember it being like quite a nice debate. I can't remember the details of it. But I thought, let's do a reaction to it. Another reaction that I want to do at some point, and another live, but that'll be later, maybe a couple months away, is we're going to do a live stream reaction to the Cosmic Skeptic David Benatar interview, whatever you call it. And that is going to be with a special guest. It's not the special guest you're thinking. It's not with David Benatar. But there's going to be a special guest for that one, who's going to join the stream. So that hopefully will be fun. But there's no date in the diary for that one yet. But if there's anything else anyone wants to see a live stream about or a reaction to, then email it to me. My email is in the description, or contact me some other way if I'm already in contact with you. Now, before we get into today's stream, so when I look down here, I'm looking at the chat. So welcome to the chat, Sid the Sloth, Mark Squeeze as well. Now, before we get into today's reaction, and I will show you what we're reacting to today if you don't know already. So it is this debate between David Benatar and Bruce Blackshaw. Should we let humanity go extinct? Now, this is on the Unbelievable channel, which are, I don't know them insanely well. I've watched a few of their videos, but it's a Christian apologetics channel, I'm pretty sure. Well, no, that is what it is. And Bruce Blackshaw is a Christian. So it's, I remember it being a very interesting one. David Benatar talking about antinatalism with a Christian. So it's different from the conversations that we usually see, because a lot of the arguments or debates or discussions around antinatalism often are had within the context of like a secular understanding of the world, which I think is a more accurate understanding of the world. But not everyone does. And so you've got to engage with people sometimes on their terms. So yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting one. Let me come back onto me for a minute. So that's what we're going to be reacting to. We're going to be reacting in a minute. The other thing I wanted to say was, talking of David Benatar, so I recently finished his Very Practical Ethics, which is the book he's recently published. And I did an interview with him, which was very cool. So that is going to be out soon. I don't know exactly when it's going to be out. Hopefully it'll be out on Sunday. Basically, just to update people, it's done, it's edited, it's finished. The only issue is when I uploaded it, there was a slight issue which I haven't really come across before, which means that I don't want to publish it with that issue. So I'm like I've contacted and I'm waiting on them to do something, the YouTube technical team. So we'll see what comes from that. Hopefully it'll be out on Sunday. If it isn't, it will almost definitely be next week. I think that is everything. Let's see who's in the chat before we get cracking. So no one new in the chat. Cool. Okay, nice one. All right. Kodak is in the chat. Welcome to the stream, Kodak. And there is a weird... For some reason, the air in here feels really dry all of a sudden. And I don't know why that is. But anyway, let's keep going. So, what we are going to do is because sometimes people don't, find the audio a bit hard to hear, we are going to be watching a downloaded version which I boosted the volume on, and also they had inserted ads or trailers for other stuff on their channel, so I've removed those as well. So hopefully that'll make for smoother viewing. So I think that is everything. I think we can get into it.
Well, today on the show, we're looking at antinatalism and asking, should we let humans go extinct? David Benatar and Bruce Blackshaw are my guests today. It's a rather unusual conversation for you as we hear about this philosophy of antinatalism from one of its leading proponents, South African professor of philosophy David Benatar. Now, antinatalists argue that it's a moral duty for people to stop having any children so that human life dies out on the planet. And in his book, Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, David Benatar argues that it's always morally wrong to create more sentient beings. And we're going to find out why he believes that today. As I say, it's a controversial philosophy, but one which is becoming more widespread. There's a growing antinatalist community who advocate finding ethical ways to make life go extinct on planet Earth. And we'll be discussing to what extent David's own...
Yeah, so, I think sometimes... Well, I was going to say I think sometimes people outside of the antinatalist world who are maybe just having a cursory glance at it make this confusion. But actually, a lot of people inside the antinatalist world also make this, what I see as a confusion. So there's often this conflation between antinatalism and, what could be called extinctionism, right? And he's kind of already done it twice. So... One, he referenced, he said something along the lines of, antinatalists think it's always wrong to, morally wrong to reproduce, and that humans should, go extinct. And then just there, he said that, they're always looking for ethical ways to facilitate human extinction. Now, it can be very common for someone to have both an antinatalist view and an extinctionist view, and their extinctionist view be strongly informed by their antinatalist view. So it can come across as really nitpicky, but there is actually a difference. One, antinatalism is just saying this specific act is morally wrong, i.e. creating sentient beings. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that's basically it.
We bring children in this world and we raise them to be warriors against evil.
Thank you so much for the donation, Bovine Blue Stocking. Legend as always. And you brought back to me the sweet tones of that guru who I've forgotten what religion he was from. But I still remember his face. But you've brought back to me his sweet tones, so thank you for that. And Bovine says, hey, Lawrence, I've been enjoying Animal Horizon a lot, but it's nice of you to do a live stream on your own channel at last. Welcome back. Thank you very much, Bovine. Yes, if anyone doesn't know, Animal Horizon is a new show that's had 3, I think, episodes so far with my friend David Rams. If you just go on go into the YouTube search bar, type in David Rams, you'll find his channel. He has a channel where he talks about animal ethics, animal rights, animal advocacy. And we recently started doing a show where we sort of bring news stories surrounding animals to the show, and basically present on them, discuss them, that sort of stuff. And yeah, it's very good, very fun. There are 3 episodes so far that you can go and watch now. So go to his channel, just click on the live tab, and they are there. And the next one will be next week, next Wednesday. But yes, it has been long overdue to do a live on this channel, and hopefully I'll be doing them more regularly as well. If you want them to be more regularly, then send me over stuff to that you think will be good for lives. I've got a couple that I have planned to do, but you know, the more material, the more lives there will be. So there we go. But thank you very much for the donation. And I've just seen we've had another one as well, which is over on YouTube as a super chat, which usually come through to the back end and flash up on screen, but this one hasn't. I don't know if it's just going to be a bit delayed. But this one is from Mario. Thank you so much, Mario. Absolute, or in brackets, Mamio. I don't know which one you want to go for, Mario, Mamio, but thank you so much. Absolute legend. No message. Mario, if you want to send a message, because you can with super chats, if you want to send one just in the chat, I will pick it up and read it out for you. But thank you so much, Mario, for the support. Yeah, it really helps everyone support, cover costs. And yeah, it's amazing stuff. Thank you so much. And there's been a few, I mean, I think I mentioned this last time, but there's been a few upgrades to things that you can't see there, but it's very much helped me with getting stuff sorted and being more productive. One of the things I actually recently invested in, which came from YouTube money, which you can't see right now because it's out of camera frame, but it's literally right here, is a desk, a proper desk, because I mean, I had a desk before, but it was very small and cramped, and it was just difficult to do stuff on. Now I've got this proper desk. I can be more laid out. I have all my stuff in place. And yeah, it's just much more like nice and efficient way of working on scripts. I've got a script I've been working on for a long time coming up for an Ethilism video, which some of you may remember is coming soon. That is in the very final stages now, so it should be out in the next 2 weeks, very likely out in the next 2 weeks, and hopefully people will find it interesting and enjoy it. But yes, thank you for those 2 back-to-back donations. Thank you so much. And if you want to send in a donation, then you can do via super chat or via the link in the pinned chat as well. And you can send in a message that I will read out, and you'll be able to support. But thank you so much. Cool. Okay. I was talking about the difference between antinatalism and extinctionism. I don't know exactly where I got with that. I don't know if I'd kind of finished, but basically basically for me, antinatalism just goes as far as like, this action is wrong, let's stop doing that. In the real world, that will lead to extinction if everyone does that. Human extinction, right? If everyone does that, and we'll stop breeding the animals we breed as well. But that's more just sort of like a natural consequence or a practical consequence of not reproducing it. That, to me, that's not the focus. That's not the aim of antinatalism. Someone can be an antinatalist and also actively want there to be extinction. That to me would mean they're an antinatalist and an extinctionist. But yeah, obviously antinatalism, extinction is a conversation you will have relevant to antinatalism, obviously very relevant to antinatalism, but it doesn't mean it's an inherent part, in my view anyway. But cool. Okay, let's get back to the intro to the debate.
Outlook as an atheist informs his views on antinatalism. Well, in conversation with David today is Aussie Christian philosopher Bruce Blackshaw, who's a doctoral researcher at Birmingham University. Among other things, Bruce has written extensively on the moral case against abortion, an issue which obviously ties into today's debate. He believes that while antinatalism is, in a sense, a consistent argument for an atheist to hold, he actually thinks, from a Christian perspective, it's the wrong way to look at life and human value. So I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to be having on the programme today. Welcome along in the studio, Bruce, and on the line.
And we raise them to be warriors against evil.
And we have another donation. Thank you so much. This person doesn't give their name, so I won't read out who they are, but they say, keep up the good work, man. Thank you so much. I will try my best to do so. I plan to do so. Yeah. Bunch more, like, I've got loads of ideas, loads of stuff coming. It is just a matter of time. It's just a matter of getting the time to do stuff. Many of you will know that I work a full-time job. So, I do this in my spare time. And yeah, if you're doing something in your spare time, it means you can't put as much time into it as you'd want to. So I would very happily do this full time and I would get so much more done, but that isn't the case. So, unfortunately, I'm not able to produce as much, but loads of stuff planned, loads of stuff coming. It's just a matter of time of getting it out there. But thank you so much for the support and also the words of support as well.
David, we'll begin with you. And I should first of all say it was a fellow South African listener, Jeremy Behrman, who I should give a shout out to, who first made me aware of antinatalism and your work, David. But your profile's had quite a boost recently, hasn't it? You were featured, I think, in the New Yorker a couple of years ago to explain this concept of antinatalism. And I can imagine that when most people hear this idea, whatever their religious convictions may be, they see it as a pretty extreme, almost fringe kind of view. How do you find people respond usually to antinatalism when they first hear about it, David?
Well, perhaps I should first clarify what I understand by the term antinatalism, because you've linked it quite closely to the extinction of humanity. And
okay, here we go. So he's going to make, well, I can't presume, but I think he's going to make the same clarification that I was just making. So let's see.
Sentient species more generally. And although that is an implication of antinatalism, as I understand it, many antinatalists don't believe that extinction will actually result from people's commitments to antinatalism.
Okay.
So I, for one, am under no illusions that people are en masse.
Right. So slightly different clarification, but it's a clarification worth making, so that people don't get the impression that we are these, delusional people that think that we have way more influence on reality than we actually do. So yeah,
are going to be persuaded by antinatalist ideas and that human extinction will result from that. There are obviously different ways of understanding what one means by antinatalism. I understand it as the view that we ought not to be creating new sentient beings. Of course, if everybody were to act on that, then there would be no more sentient people. And to prevent non-human sentient beings from coming into existence, that would, of course, require some kind of positive intervention rather than simply abstaining on the part of humans from procreation. So that's about what it is. And then your question was about what reactions are to it.
Yes.
And I think you're correct that reactions are in general negative. And I think that's irrespective of whether people have a religious background or not. But there is a sizable minority of people, it's turned out to be a much larger group of people than I imagined, who are actually very sympathetic to this idea. Many of these people believe that they were alone in believing that it's wrong to create new beings, and they gain some measure of comfort from knowing that that sort of view is being defended.
And as I said in my introduction, are these people, as they have been able to gather together more? In fact, I ran across an antinatalist podcast the other day that you had contributed to recently.
I'm guessing that must have been the Exploring Antinatalism podcast, the one that Amanda runs. If anyone doesn't know, it's the main antinatalist podcast out there. There are a few other antinatalist podcasts that have been I'm just trying to think if I'm like massively blanking, and there are other podcasts that are currently going. If you count Antinatalism Around the World as a podcast, which it is technically listed as a podcast on my channel, but I always forget that it's listed as a podcast because I sort of see it in my mind as just like a, it's one of the videos I do and it's like linked as a series. But yeah, Exploring Antinatalism is like the main antinatalist podcast that's going at the moment. And it's got many episodes. So if you don't know about it, go check it out. There's plenty of interesting interviews on there. Benatar has been on it. I've been on it. So yeah, go check it out if you haven't already.
Are they looking to find ways of encouraging people not to procreate, not to have more children? Are they actively, if you like, is there an activism around this philosophy?
There is. So there are some people who are engaged in antinatalism activism. There are other antinatalists for whom it's a personal decision, but they're not engaged in any activism of any kind. So as with lots of worldviews, one's going to get a variation among people who adhere to them.
Just to explain then, and probably it's worth saying as well for those who are watching via video that you won't be seeing David on the video today, as David prefers to keep his image out of the public spotlight. But just talk to us about antinatalism then, and how you came to the conclusion that it would be better off for people never to have existed rather than for life to be brought into the world. What was again, this will have to be very much a thumbnail sketch, obviously, of a much bigger philosophical argument that you make. But what's at the heart of this idea of antinatalism?
Well, I think there are a number of arguments for that conclusion. The one is that it seems to me there's nothing to be gained from coming into existence. Although if you come into existence, there are certain joys that you'll have, certain pleasures that you'll have, certain good things that you'll experience. If you never had come into existence, you would not have been deprived of those absences.
I think this is like one of the most fundamental intuitions or points that antinatalists have that differ from many other people is simply because, one of the reasons why so many people try to rationalize the suffering that goes on that humans cause or are caused to individuals by bringing them into existence. So much of the rationalization comes from the fact that they view coming into existence as some sort of benefit. There's some sort of good to it. And I think sometimes some of the reasons why there's this disconnect between antinatalists communicating with natalists is because natalists can very much be of this view of trying to weigh up the goods and the bads. And even if they do reach a conclusion that in some instances it's not okay to bring someone into existence, that's just because they've weighed up the goods and bads, and the bads have outweighed the goods, right? But in many other instances, they may see the goods as outweighing the bads. And I think often they get disillusioned by antinatalists solely focusing on the suffering. But the reason that antinatalists solely focus on the suffering is because I can't speak for all antinatalists, because there are arguments you can make that don't rely on coming into existence not being a benefit. But many antinatalists don't see coming into existence as a benefit. There's no good there. There's no inherent good. So there's no weighing up to be done. If there is suffering or harm caused by bringing someone into existence, which we know there is, and there's a lot of it, there's a significant amount, there's no weighing up to be done, because the goods don't count to anything. The goods once you exist, because they aren't a benefit, right? And so I think this is one of the sort of fundamental view shifts or differences between an antinatalist and a natalist that can cause so much crossed wires and breakdown in communication, because they're looking at the question in such different ways. And the way that antinatalists speak, and I'm sure I do this, a lot, is it disillusions people, because people can't see why antinatalists aren't taking into account those goods. Maybe I'll have to make a video on it at some point, why. Well, I say I'll have to. I already have planned a couple of videos on this very topic. It's just a matter of time of getting to them. But there's two big videos I have in mind for this topic. One video is I want to dive into this phrase, make people happy, not happy people, which is known as Narveson's dictum. And then the other video I want to make on this topic is I want to do a video series doing a deep dive into each of the core arguments for antinatalism. And one of those obviously will be the axiological asymmetry, which kind of gets at the root of this, right? And I think those two videos will really get into this idea of coming into existence not being a benefit, and really lay it out if I do it well. It's just a matter of like getting to it. I've got like loads of notes for both of them, but there's just so much to do and very little time to do it. Sentient Soy says, I'm of the mind that suffering, pain, frustration should be weighed more than pleasure. I think it has a stronger impact on your experience. Yeah, I agree. And I don't have it. I don't have it to hand, but it's literally right there behind the bed, because it's the next book I'm going to read, which is Magnus Vinding's Suffering Focused Ethics, which I'm very much looking forward to reading, but I haven't actually started yet. So that is going to be the next one for me to read. Cool. Let's continue.
There's an existing person who lacks some joy. There's somebody who's harmed by that absence. But if there's an absent joy because there's nobody to have that joy, it looks to me like there's no downside to that. Whereas if you bring somebody into existence, there are very certain harms that they're going to experience. Quite which harms and the array of harms and how intense those are will vary from person to person. But my argument is that even the best human lives contain considerable bad. And so the idea is that there's nothing to be gained for the being you'd bring into existence and quite a lot to lose. And therefore, for that reason, we ought not to bring new children into the world.
Obviously, in a sense, though, there is almost a natural instinct within us to procreate, to bring life, and so on. And many people, I think, would push back and say, but surely overall, the benefits, the joys outweigh the potential negatives of.
I mean, I know he's got to present questions, right? Otherwise, the interview's going to go nowhere, and he's got to present questions that people listening will have, because that's one of the sort of purposes of an interview, right? Is obviously you want to bring your own questions that you're specifically going to be interested in, but you've also got to bring the audience along with you. So I get that. But he has just asked a question that David Benatar has already answered. He's just said about how there's no benefit to coming into existence. And he's then just said, but you've got to take into account the benefits, right? So, yeah. Final Fantasy Debater says, you're doing important work here on making a video advocating for antinatalism. We all ought to do so. Ought to be doing such in order to increase the odds of convincing someone not to birth. Thank you so much, Final Fantasy. I appreciate that. It would be excellent to see more people making videos. At the moment, there are 63 people watching. I don't know exactly everyone who is going to be watching at the moment or who will watch this back later. But there are skills and resources that each of us will have that we can use to contribute to, promoting ideas that we think are gonna, do good and make the world a better place and make people behave in a more ethical way. And yeah, I say to everyone watching, like, if there's something you feel you can do, some way you can add to this, then please do. If that's making videos, making art, writing, interviewing like this guy is, like, I've done some on my channel. I've done some interviews, one coming up. So yeah, it would be really nice to see other people, making good, really useful, high quality content. Because at the moment there are literally only like a couple of people that I can think of that are making what is, in my judgment, like regular, good quality content about antinatalism. Yeah, and we need more of those people. So get inventive and strap in if you can. Yeah, it would be really nice to see other people doing stuff.
Of bringing new life into existence. Why for you isn't that a good argument against what you're saying here, David?
I think it's precisely because there are these very deep biological drives that we should distrust the judgments that people make. So in the book Better Never to Have Been, I review quite a lot of psychological literature which points to our unreliability in making judgments about the quality of life. So people, for example, in general, have an optimism bias that manifests in a variety of ways. They tend to recollect the good more than the bad. They tend to think that the future will go better than it actually does tend to go. There are lots of manifestations of this optimism bias. People also make judgments about the quality of life by comparing themselves with other people. And so if other people have got similar downsides to their lives, that tends not to feature in their own calculation of the quality of their own lives. So there are lots of reasons why we should not trust most people's judgments about the quality of their life.
It's very interesting. I've got about 1,000 questions I actually want to ask you in the course of this show. We probably won't have time for all of them, David. But one that did obviously occur to me as fairly prescient at the time that we're recording this show. It comes in the midst of this present global coronavirus crisis. And it's sort of an interesting backdrop in a way to have this sort of theoretical conversation about whether we should, in principle, try to let humanity go extinct. I suppose I want to ask you, what is your view on possible biological or ecological threats to human existence? I mean, in one way, do you see them as potentially good things on balance if they actually cause less humans to ultimately exist in the world?
Well, remember, I think that there are good and bad ways of bringing about human extinction, and I'm not in favor of bringing about extinction through killing people or through the deaths of people, because that involves real costs to individuals. The cost-free way to extinction is by failing to bring new people into existence. So although existing people would die, there'd not be new people brought into existence who would then live, suffer, and die. So it's my goal is not extinction per se by any means
Yeah. So, well,
necessary. I'm trying to avoid bad things befalling people, and the very best way to do that is not to create them in the first place.
I mean, obviously,
yeah, I feel like he kind of made the clarification there. I mean, he did add on the bit about any means necessary. But it seemed like he was passing those two things apart, antinatalism and extinctionism. Maybe I'm reading a bit too much into it, though.
As you say, it's an extremely unlikely scenario, but if everyone simply did stop procreating, obviously within a generation or so, there would be no humans on the planet any longer. And for you, any costs associated with that, say, of the sadness of people who would have liked to be parents not getting the joy of being parents, would be outweighed presumably by the fact that future generations of people who could have suffered won't suffer.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's like he's framing in the question, and I'm assuming like Benatar's going to answer. It's like I did a video recently about one of the biases that people, or the inconsistencies people have about how, people treat like future people, people who don't exist yet, in ways that you just would not do with an existing person. And it exposes a massive hypocrisy. And if imagine this guy, imagine if you were to remove that element, that hypocrisy from the question and reframe the question so it doesn't have that double standard. And you'd essentially be asking a question like this: isn't it a bad thing that certain people can't impose all of the harms of a lifetime on someone else so that they don't feel bad about something they can't do? Is essentially what he's asking, right? Because if someone feels bad or unfulfilled in some way because they don't reproduce, obviously that's unfortunate and sad for them. Like, I want to empathize with them. I don't want to demonize them in some way. I understand, look, they also didn't choose to be here. They were brought into existence. They didn't get to consent to that. Presumably, they didn't just conjure up this feeling in themselves to want to reproduce. It would have been biological, the culture around them, the expectations of others, all of this sort of stuff, right? So they're in a situation not of their own making, in part anyway. And so if there's this ethical imperative saying, no, you shouldn't do this thing that you really want to do and have been expecting to do for ages, I can empathize with someone who feels really bad about that, right? Who doesn't do that thing because of the ethical imperative. Or maybe it's not to do with ethics at all. Maybe, I don't know, maybe they are just infertile. I empathize with those people. But to prioritize your own feeling bad above the heavy ethical questions of imposing a lifetime's worth of suffering that you can't even predict really, but it's going to be significant on someone else, so that you don't have to go through that, period of feeling bad and unfulfilled. Like, I've already said I feel empathy but that's extreme selfishness. Come on. Like, to think of your own feelings so highly that you feel like the world revolves around you and you can do essentially whatever you want, to counter those feelings. Okay, maybe I'm being a bit unfair. It's not whatever you want. But you can do something so significant as to create someone so that you don't feel those feelings. This is preposterous. This is putting way too much moral importance on your feelings. We all have feelings, people's feelings should be protected when it's appropriate. But to say that you can impose such significant harm on someone else, because if you don't, you're going to feel, bad and unfulfilled, as someone may do if they don't reproduce. This is just not getting this is not prioritizing the morally appropriate thing to prioritize. Yeah. And I know, again, obviously he's got to ask questions that lead the interview, bring the viewer along with him. And many of the viewers are going to be people who have never come across antinatalism before. So you've got to kind of ask these questions. But the fact that that question is asked just shows how fucked the world is that we live in. Yeah, I don't know what more I can say on that.
Would that be the way you'd kind of do the cost benefit analysis on that one?
Well, I don't deny that there would be disadvantages to existing people in not bringing into existence new generations. The question, though, is whether we are entitled to treat other people as means to our ends in that way.
But yeah, but it's like it's treating people as a means to your ends, but it's like it's using them as a means in a way that there's a very good chance they get cancer and there's a guarantee that they will die. And it's also putting them in the same predicament that you are in, right? You're going to create them. They're very likely going to have the same urges and cultural influence as you, so they're going to want to reproduce. You're just handing the problem onto them. Like Philip Larkin said in This Be the Verse, man hands on misery to man. You're just kicking the can down the road, pushing this problem onto the next generation. Yeah, I don't know. It's just just seems to me like an extreme form of selfishness and self-centeredness.
So if you keep producing new generations for our benefit, and then those new generations have to suffer, and they need to produce new generations for their benefit, what we have is what I call a procreational Ponzi scheme. And eventually it's going to go bust, like all Ponzi schemes do. There will come a time when humanity will go extinct. It's very unlikely to be as a result of antinatalist convictions. It's much more likely to be the result of some meteor from outer space, or some the planet becoming uninhabitable, or a disease that ravages the Earth. Those are the likely explanations. And then there will be a final generation. So it's not like we can avoid that evil. That evil will occur one way or another. The question is whether it's going to be sooner or later.
Interesting. I want to come back, obviously, as well to the aspect of how your atheism sort of affects the way you kind of do the weighing up of these issues as well. And I think that'll be relevant as well for my other guest, who I'm going to introduce now, Bruce Blackshaw, who's a Christian philosopher. Because, Bruce, you're a Christian and you've done a lot of work around the bioethics of abortion. Now, we'll kind of come to how that ties into this particular debate a little later, but I think this is the first time you've formally interacted with this antinatalist sort of philosophy.
Yeah, that's right. This is my first encounter.
Yeah, what's your understanding of where this has come from, and why it is being adopted apparently by increasing numbers of people, and your overall response to it? I'd be interested in, first of all.
Well, I've read David's book. I've read 3 of his books now, I think, and
you got to give it to the guy. You know, that's commitment. I don't know if he read 3 of the books for this interview, or if maybe he read Better Never to Have Been for this interview, and maybe The Human Predicament to prepare for the interview. I'd wonder what the third one was. I mean, I'm guessing those other 2 were, you know, definitely in, you know, because they're relevant to this interview. But yeah, you got to admire the guy's commitment to the interview.
The idea that life is a harm and not a gift is quite an alien one to me. I think particularly so as a Christian. But in philosophy, we don't write off a view just because it's an unattractive one. We want to know if it has support, if there are good reasons for believing it. And having gone through David's work, I've read quite a few academic responses. Philosophically, I think he's got a good case. And so we can't just write it off and say we don't like what he's saying. We have to, you know, dive a little bit deeper. And
when you say philosophically he's got a good case, is that if you accept, if you like, the fundamental premises of the way we do these kind of calculations of cost and
it's benefit? Not so much that. As I understand, just to dive into the philosophy just a little, there is something philosophers call the asymmetry, which is that we have a duty to avoid bringing people into existence who would lead miserable lives, but we don't really have a duty to bring into existence those who would have happy lives. A lot of philosophers think that makes a lot of sense, but that sort of intuition we have is quite difficult to explain, and many philosophers have tried to do so, and maybe David can correct me here, but as I understand it, his argument for antinatalism does provide an explanation for this asymmetry. And very few people have managed to provide such an explanation. So that is one good reason for accepting his views. Could you just comment on that, David?
We bring children in this world and we raise them to be warriors against evil.
Thank you so much for the support, the super chat. That is just from M. Thank you so much, M. And M says, keep up the good work, homie. Thank you so much. I appreciate it for the support, and I will keep it up. Like I said, lots I want to do, just a matter of time. But yeah, some exciting stuff. One exciting thing I will actually mention now, just in case anyone doesn't know and hasn't seen it. We're going to advertise it more closer to the time. But there was an announcement from Antinatalist Advocacy saying that there is going to be another conference this year. So the Antinatalist Advocacy Conference will be back for 2025, AAC 25. We are currently booking speakers, and we've got some exciting speakers that I think people, you know, will like to hear from. And yeah, I won't say any more because we haven't released any more details publicly. But there is going to be another conference, and it will be in the later part of the year. So you got that to look forward to, and plenty more stuff to come. I've just got to get on with it. But thank you so much for the support.
Yeah, I think you're correct. There are other advantages as well to accepting the asymmetries that I think underlie my argument. For example, they solve a whole range of problems in population ethics that are otherwise quite intractable.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah,
there are numerous advantages to this view.
Yeah, there are a number of asymmetries, but that's the particular one that seems to be one of the most important ones. And so even to me, it's a conclusion I don't like. I do recognise that there is some strengths in your argument.
There's a kind of a logic to it.
There is a logic to the argument, and I guess I'm interested too to know whether David himself likes the conclusion of the argument or whether it's something you've come to reluctantly. Is that if you come to it through logical argument, think, well, this is the best explanation?
That's an interesting question, David. Do you kind of like the consequences, if you like, of your philosophical reasoning here?
Well, I don't like all the consequences, because the thought, let's say, of people not having children when they want to have children and being saddened by not having children, that's hardly something that one can like.
Sure.
But it does strike me that the conclusion is true.
Another part of the loss, if you like, that I feel with the idea of antinatalism is the idea that, let's say, hypothetically, that you did get to that presumably best outcome of no future generations of people existing. What you would lose in terms of simply the idea that humans wouldn't continue, that no future art, music, literature, cultural development would ever happen. It feels to me like you're maybe losing something that's a little bit hard to put a value on somehow. So I don't know if that factors at all as well, Dave.
We bring children in this world and we raise them to be warriors against evil.
We have another super chat come through. Thank you so much. This one's from Final Destination. And Final Destination says, love your work, Lawrence. Keep it up indeed, man. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the support. And I will be keeping it up. There is more to come. And yeah, if people have ideas, like I said, for live streams or things they want to see videos on, please send it to me via email. If you have emailed me or you're going to email me, I will get back to you at some point, but sometimes I'm just behind on things. Sometimes I take a while to reply, but I will get your email and I will get back to you at some point. So yeah, if there's anything people come across, please do send it over. But thank you so much, Final Destination. I appreciate it.
In the way you look at this.
Well, I think when we view that sort of prospect with sadness, we're engaged in sentimentalism. We sort of want the human project to continue because we are human and we want there to be something of humanity that survives us. But it's hard, I think, when we look at reasons for why we should be sad, for us to be sad about that. If there are no more humans left, nobody to appreciate art and music, well, the absence of those things is not bad. And we don't spend any time worrying about how on Mars, for example, or Jupiter, there's no sentient life and therefore no a Martian art and music. We never spend any time worrying about that. So if there were a future in which Earth were uninhabited by human beings, and therefore there were no human creations at that point, no ongoing human creations, I don't think that'd be something that'd be...
Okay, it's an interesting point. I mean, coming back to you, Bruce.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't like, I guess, strictly something related to antinatalism. It's just like a general point of like, you know, what is value and stuff. But I remember when I was at university, I went to, there was some sort of conference there. And I'm trying to remember if, I think it was specifically a vegan conference, but I can't really remember. There was a woman at my university who set up some sort of animal studies network or something like that, and there was some sort of conference she put together, but I can't remember the specific topic, but I think it was on veganism. And there was this guy who came to give a presentation. I can't remember what the presentation was on, but I had a conversation with him afterwards, and he was talking about how he thinks that there can be certain things that they're inanimate objects. They're not sentient beings or anything like this. Inanimate objects, and I think he gave the example of architecture. Certain buildings, just have really nice, like architecture, and he said that these things have value in and of themselves. So even if there weren't any valuer, like no humans around or other sentient beings to gain any value from this building, it would still have value somehow in and of itself. And that was really peculiar to me. I don't know if there's any knockdown argument against someone thinking that. Maybe that's just like the way they think, because to me, there has to be some sort of sentient conscious being to derive some benefit from something or find value in something. It doesn't make sense to me for that building to have value if there's no valuer. I don't know how much more I can say on it. Like, why would a building have, I mean, the building is just a collection of atoms, like, why would it have any value if, like, it's not providing some value to someone to see it and find beauty in it, or be in it and get shelter from it and warmth and stuff like this, or it provides some other purpose. It's just at that point, it's just a collection of atoms, but it's arranged in a way where somehow value arises from it, which just doesn't make sense to me if it's not within the context of there being some conscious experience, sentient experience that relates to it somehow. Maybe it's just a fundamental difference, and this guy just, value works in a different way for him. But yeah, I found that very very like weird view to interact with, and it was very different from my own. And it's not to say it's wrong, maybe I'm wrong, but it was just like there was such a gap there that I couldn't breach it. And it kind of it relates to this in terms of like, if you just focus on humans, because obviously if humans phased out, there would still be other animals that could find value in things. But if you ignore that for a minute and you just focus on humans, if all humans went away, the things that he's pointing to, like art, what else did he talk about? Culture, stuff like this. Like, we talk about that stuff as having value and we find value in it, but that's because all of that stuff serves some value. It serves value to us. If we're not here, I don't understand how it could retain that value. But yeah. And I can see David's in the chat, who we were mentioning earlier about Animal Horizon. And David's saying, I'd like to see you debate more people. Yeah, I've got none lined up, but I mean, at some point in the future there will be other debates. But if people want to see any debates, then there is a debates playlist on my channel. You can go there and I don't know how many I've done, but there's quite a few there, with quite a range of people as well. Religious people, libertarians, vegans, who else are there? Just random people, a father, all sorts of people. But yeah, there will be more in the future. I've got none planned at the moment. There is actually, I'll talk about it very vaguely because it hasn't been made publicly yet. But at the one thing that we want to be part of the conference later in the year is some form of debate, but that's not totally confirmed yet. But that is one debate that's maybe on the horizon. Cool.
You've said that you can see the logical consistency from an atheistic perspective of antinatalism, having read through it and looked at the responses. Why then, as a Christian, do you find the idea actually, I suppose, in some sense, doesn't make sense to you from that perspective? Why do you come to a different conclusion ultimately? Because you don't share, presumably, the atheistic underpinnings of David.
Okay, that's a good question. While I was researching this talk, I did come across Mark 14 verse 21, which says, "Woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man," which Jesus is speaking, referring to Judas. "It would be better for him if he had not been born." So,
that's an interesting,
So I thought,
analogy.
hang on a minute, that's endorsing David's argument here. So I thought David might appreciate that.
Okay, well, that verse aside, what's your general kind of reason, though, why you don't think this philosophy kind of holds from a Christian perspective?
Well, from a Christian perspective, I think God has himself, if we accept the Christian point of view, God himself has placed a lot of value on human beings. If we look at Romans, Ephesians 1 verse 4, for he chose us in him before the creation of the world. And to me that says God has a long-term plan for each one of our lives, and we are chosen for a purpose. And if God has chosen us, that places tremendous value upon each human life. And so
the cost-benefit analysis isn't simply about the pleasure versus pain that any potential life may...
Exactly, yeah.
It's actually about some intrinsic value to,
That's right.
to being alive.
That's right. And I guess from a Christian view, that's pretty obvious that God has placed a lot of value on us. And I'm interested to see what David...
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert at all in Christian theology, but just reacting to that from just hearing what he's saying, I would need to look at the passage that he's read and read it in its full context. But from what he's saying, even if that passage, as he's saying, shows that, God, sort of places value on the existence of humans being around, that doesn't necessarily say anything about how many humans. And at least in what he was saying there, this purpose is pretty vague. Like, the purpose wasn't defined. Maybe it is defined in the Bible somewhere and it's made clear, but I'm just going off what he was saying. But yeah, it doesn't specify how many humans. Like, we're 8 billion, If God does intrinsically value some existence of humans, that doesn't lead you to the conclusion that we need to have 8 or more billion, right? You could still adopt an antinatalist position as a Christian and say we need to have a way smaller population of humans. And I can even kind of, again, I'm no expert, but I can even kind of see that being in accordance with, a lot of the rest of Christianity, in terms of, if there's a lot less humans, then you're going to have a lot less strain on the environment, and we'll be causing a lot less destruction to God's, garden and creation, because we're not only God's creation, the world would be God's creation. So I can imagine that being generally in accordance, this idea of like Christian, it wouldn't be strictly Christian antinatalism, but it would kind of be like Christian reducing populationism, or whatever you'd call it, Malthusianism. So I could kind of understand that, but again, I'm no expert. I don't know, all of the context around the passage he's mentioned and stuff. But yeah, I don't necessarily seeing that be an argument for maintaining the status quo or anything like that, or even increasing the human population. It could fit with at least a reduction in population, from my understanding. But again, no expert.
Thinks of whether consciousness itself has intrinsic value, whether he thinks the fact that there are sentient beings in the universe is a better universe than if they're not sentient beings in the universe. Could you comment on that one, David?
Yes, I don't think it's better, because sentience comes with all the horrors of existence. So if you're insentient, then you never suffer. They're not bad things that befall you in a meaningful way. It's not that there can't be bad things that happen to you, just don't think it matters if you're not sentient.
Right.
So I actually think a world without consciousness, without sentience, is a much better world.
It is a strangely kind of contradictory view, though, to most people's intuitions. And I speak here of most atheists I know, actually, David, because in a sense, if an atheist doesn't believe that there's any kind of intrinsic value to human life, given by God, but nonetheless is glad that life arose, albeit by some, happy accident or whatever, they generally want to see that life continue, and they're glad that it's there, and they do all they can to make sure it does flourish and continue in the world, rather than seeking to eliminate it in the universe. They're glad that consciousness arose by whatever means. So it's a sort of a strange kind of paradox that you actually stand against that quite natural intuition, I think, in many people, that well, now life's here, let's celebrate it, let's make it continue, let's cause it to flourish, rather than wanting to ultimately see it die out.
there are lots of things you said there that I would like to address. So one is about continued consciousness of an individual, and the other is about continuing consciousness by creating new conscious beings. So I do think that if a being already exists in a conscious state, that it has some interest in continuing to exist, which is one of the reasons why I think it's bad for that being to kill it or for it to die. But it's a separate question about whether it's good to create new conscious beings so that there will be conscious beings in the future. But another point is that you've implied on a few occasions that there's a kind of divide here between theists and atheists. On the other hand,
because I feel like Benatar's going to go on to this point. So before he does, one interesting thing, and again, I'm no expert in this, but one interesting thing is that from my understanding, actually, for the majority of history, when antinatalism has been present, it has been in a religious form, is my understanding. You do have examples of antinatalism in history where it doesn't seem to be intimately tied to religion. But there are also many examples where it is part of a very religious worldview. And the most well-known example is the Gnostics. And there were many different sects. And at some point, I'm going to do more research on this and do a video on it. But from my understanding at the moment, essentially how the Gnostics viewed the world is that the world was actually created by this evil supernatural being, which they refer to as the demiurge. And as such, the world and life is kind of seen as like a prison trapped in this world of suffering that was created by the demiurge. And as such, we should not be bringing new souls or people, however you want to phrase it, into the world, because we'll be bringing them into a world that is controlled by the devil, basically by evil. Which is really interesting. I mean, it's completely different from how I see the world, but it's super interesting. And I think people do get this impression that there is this inherent link between antinatalism and irreligiosity, atheism, materialism, because the predominant strands of antinatalism are within a secular context today. But that wasn't always the case. And I think it's just people's ignorance of that allow them to make this tight association. But let's see what Benatar's going to say, because I don't know what examples he's going to use.
Acknowledge that there are a lot of atheists who are not antinatalists. And so what I would like to do is really just emphasize that I don't think that the divide is along atheist or theistic lines. Bruce has provided me with some quotations from the New Testament which seem to support an antinatalist view. In Better Never to Have Been, I cited a number of biblical verses that also support an antinatalist idea. And one of the things I do in the book, albeit briefly, is to try to show that these ideas should not be readily dismissed on religious grounds. There are actually streams of religious thinking that do support antinatalism. In Christianity, there was a sect, the Shakers, that were resolutely opposed to procreation. As you can imagine, they're a very small sect, and they danger of dying out. They can only get converts in. They can't get new progeny to keep the movement going. But there is a strand of Christian thought there. In the Catholic Church, you've got priests who do not engage in procreation, or at least they ought not to engage in procreation. I cite an interesting debate in the Talmud, where curiously the view is espoused that it would have been better if humans had not created, God had not created humanity. Mm. And the Talmud relates that debate went on for 2.5 years, and eventually the decision was made in favor of that view rather than the alternative view. So there are really...
That's so interesting. I need to look into that, and I'll have to do a video on that, because I have not looked into that at all. I kind of vaguely remember him mentioning this before, but yeah, I need to look into that in more detail.
There may be minority and small streams in religious thing, but I don't think we should be viewing this as necessarily antithetical to theists. In fact, there may be some quite good theistic arguments for antinatalism. So it's going to depend in part on your metaphysics and what you think about souls. But let's imagine when you create a new being, you are bringing a new being into existence. It's not like there's some soul that's in the void and it's now being incarnated. Well, and you also, let's say, believe in original sin. Why would you want to create more beings with original sin? Why would you want to do a thing like that? If you believe in predestination, as some Christian groups do, and you believe that people are going to go to hell in certain circumstances, why would you possibly create a being that's destined for hell?
So it hasn't been mentioned in this discussion yet, but I saw H mention it in the chat about this passage, be fruitful and multiply. And one thing I've heard people respond to that, and this isn't me responding to it, this is just me conveying what I've heard, because I'm not knowledgeable enough to know if this is a sort of accurate representation. But what I've heard people say to that is that there is this passage saying be fruitful and multiply, but actually this, I have not fact checked this, so this may be completely wrong, but this passage is in the Old Testament. And if Christians are in so many other contexts saying, well, you know, don't pay too much attention to the Old Testament because the New Testament supersedes that, you know, which, I mean, personally, I've heard a lot of Christians say, I think this is a relatively common sort of thought in Christianity, but again, I may be wrong. And so it's curious then that this passage, be fruitful and multiply, is appealed to so much when we're also told that we're supposed to disregard the teachings of the Old Testament because the New Testament has come along. But when it's convenient, this passage from the Old Testament is whipped out to justify procreating, which is interesting. Again, someone else needs to fact check that. At some point, I will do a video on antinatalism and the Bible, because I also want to do a series on religious antinatalism. But again, it's just a matter of time, of having the time. But yeah, that'd be interesting. If there's anyone who knows the accuracy of what I've just said about the be fruitful and multiply thing, please do put it in the comments, and but start the message with full capital letters saying answer, and then I'll see it. But yeah.
Now, I don't want to suggest that these arguments are knockdown arguments and that all theists ought to be committed to them. What I'm suggesting is that.
So H says AI. So I think H has run this through AI. Says that interpretations extend be fruitful to encompass a broader concept of being productive and contributing positively to one's community, not just having children, which is interesting. Yeah, I mean, I can kind of get that. I think it would probably be a bit of a strain if someone said, well, depending on the context around the quote, if someone said, no, it doesn't refer to procreation, it refers to this other stuff, that would probably be a bit strained. But like you said, AI is saying there that it's extending the interpretation. So it's not precluding the reference to procreation, which is interesting.
There are strands of theistic thinking, according to which antinatalism would make eminent sense.
What do you say to that yourself, Bruce?
Yeah, well, I mean, prior to starting the talk, Justin and I were just discussing this, and yeah, I can see that there is some reason if you believe in original sin, as Christians do, and if there's an eternal punishment for sin after we die, then perhaps there is a reason not to bring people into existence.
So me and also John, who people will remember from the channel, so we've both been to Speaker's Corner, which is a place in London where people go to debate, and predominantly it's religious debates that happen there, and it's predominantly Muslims. So we've spoken to a few Muslims there, random Muslims or Muslim preachers, and we've brought up this thing about hell, and so far we haven't had any good answer. They either just divert attention away and move on and don't answer the question, or they just say, yeah, I am putting my kids at risk of hell. That seemed, and I even said it to one preacher's face. I was like, do you not see how twisted that is? Like, you're believing in something which has led you to willingly risk an innocent child going to hell, eternal damnation. Does that not give you at least a bit of hesitation. And from memory, he went, "Oh, no, 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 no. You know, this is how much like ideology or religion can warp people's thinking, or people's ethical standards." Yeah, it just seems crazy to me.
Because if they're going to suffer that punishment. So I can see some logic for that view, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of gets you into the weeds of the theology of, say, a Calvinist predestination view,
yeah.
because obviously at some level our decision to or not to have children at that level is not really in our hands if you're a thoroughgoing Calvinist anyway. So it kind of goes to a deeper level in a way. But it is a fascinating thing. I appreciate the way you've elucidated there, David, that certain strands of theology might actually be open to a kind of antinatalist sort of interpretation. We're going to go to a break, and we'll continue with more questions. I've got loads more questions that I want to throw into the mix as well on this
I've got a few as well.
because since I discovered this, rather interesting branch of philosophy, it's fascinated me as to what the consequences might be of it, and we'll continue to kind of unpack some of the Christian and atheist kind of implications, I think, of it as well as we go in today's show. We're talking about antinatalism, and as the name suggests, it's about being against procreation, believing that actually it's morally better not to create more sentient beings. That's the theme in David Benatar's book, Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence. He defends that as a philosopher. There's a growing antinatalist movement out there. But what do you think about it? I'd be interested in your responses to today's show. Remember, you can email in unbelievable@premier.org.uk. You can also send in your thoughts via our social media too, at UnbelievableJB for Twitter, facebook.com/UnbelievableJB for the Facebook page. We're over on the Instagram as well. You can find all of the links, including to my guests and their books and blogs and so on, from today's show as well at premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. And we'll be back very shortly. Welcome back. We've got a really interesting philosophical discussion today. I'm joined by two philosophers on the programme, David Benatar and Bruce Blackshaw. Now, David Benatar is South African professor of philosophy, whose book Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, outlines an antinatalist philosophy, the view that it's always morally wrong to create more sentient beings. Effectively, he argues that people should stop having children so that human life, in principle, could die out on the planet one day. Now, whether that's realistically possible is another question in a way, but we're talking about the philosophy here, the behind this. And Bruce Blackshaw joins me as well, Christian philosopher who's done a lot of research looking at the moral case around abortion. Now, I think there's a kind of an interesting practical dimension to this when it comes to the issue of abortion, because I'd be interested to know, David, on your view, what for people who do subscribe to an antinatalist view, is abortion something that they should therefore do if they find themselves pregnant for any reason, that they should actually choose to terminate that life? And what would be the boundaries on that in your view? So effectively, does antinatalism kind of necessitate abortion wherever possible?
So this is where the implications of antinatalism are going to intersect with people's other views, because you could be because you've got to remember, antinatalism is about bringing a life into existence, right? It's not about ending lives. And when you're talking about abortion, you're talking about the very start of, you're talking about the process of a being coming into existence. And so it can kind of be ambiguous as to when the being is in existence and when it isn't in the morally relevant manner, right? And you're going to have people who have different views on that. So if someone's an antinatalist, but they believe life in a morally relevant way starts at conception, like maybe a religious antinatalist, then antinatalism doesn't really have anything to say about abortion, because then you believe that life is already in existence, and then it's a question as to whether it's permissible to kill someone or not, which isn't an antinatalist question, right? An antinatalist question is whether it's permissible to create someone, and at that point, in that view, it's already created. So, but then if you have someone who says that a being comes into existence in a morally relevant way when they become sentient, when sentience develops, then you can have a conversation about abortion being part of antinatalism, because the being is going to come into existence at some point in the gestation period, right? And so the point in the gestation period before sentience arises, the being hasn't come into existence. And so if you abort the fetus, all you're doing is preventing a being from coming into existence. So you're actually fulfilling your duty under antinatalism not to create any beings. So that's how it gets really complicated with abortion, because yes, antinatalism has certain in principle implications, but actually the practical implications of antinatalism are going to be cashed out in very different ways depending on the other views you have about, primarily when a being comes into existence. So it's super interesting, and there have been debates between antinatalists on the ethics of abortion and how it interacts with antinatalism. So you've got David Benatar, who presents the pro-death view, who he's probably going to go over that now. But then you've also got the debate between Julio Cabrera and Karima Kerma, which I will try and remember to. If someone watching now could, if I don't remember, please message me to remember to put the link to that in the description of this live. And if you're watching this back, just go to the description. Hopefully the link will be there, because there was this debate between Karima Kerma and Julio Cabrera, both antinatalists, but one's pro-life, one's pro-choice. And so there is like debate around this, and there are different views by different antinatalists. So yeah, it's an interesting one, and I'm assuming Benatar's going to go into this about how you'll get different answers from different people, but yeah.
I don't think it does. You have to have some additional views that you couple with antinatalism.
Yeah, so this is like what I was saying. You have to understand how antinatalism interacts with abortion. You've got to not just understand someone's antinatalist view, but other relevant views that they have.
Antinatalism, in order to get what I call the pro-death view about abortion. So it's possible to be an antinatalist, but also to believe that a being comes into existence in the morally relevant sense at the time of conception, and then it's too late to prevent the being from coming into existence. It's already come into existence.
I could have just let him say it. I didn't know exactly how he was going to word it, but yeah.
So abortion wouldn't do that. Abortion would then kill a being. If, on the other hand, you combine antinatalism with some view about fetal moral status, such that the being only comes into existence at a later point during gestation, then you could still prevent a being from coming into existence by aborting at one of the earlier stages. So the important point is that antinatalism by itself doesn't imply anything about abortion. You have to couple it with some other view about when one comes into existence in order to get some view about abortion.
And from a personal perspective, where do you find yourself on that spectrum? Do you believe that there is a point at which sentience, if you like, occurs later in gestation, and therefore it is morally preferable to abort up to a certain point in gestation?
So part of the question is about what is the criterion for moral standing, moral status. And if you do think it's sentience, then I think you need to hold the view that the being only comes into existence in a morally relevant way around 28, 29, 30 weeks of gestation, because that's where all the evidence suggests the fetus becomes sentient.
And would that be your view, just out of interest?
My view is that sentience is an important criterion, that we should be focusing on that.
Okay. Obviously, you've done a lot of research in this area, Bruce.
I wonder what else he thinks, because he says sentience is an important criteria. So I wonder what else. Yeah.
So I'd be interested in your thoughts on the kind of.
Well, actually, I think Benatar did do a paper ages ago on abortion or fetal sentience or fetal pain, something like that, and it was called A Pain in the Fetus. Again, I will try and find a link to that and put it in the description. I'll try and remember. I should really have a notepad and a pen here to note stuff down. But yeah, there's also that. So maybe he goes into it a bit more there.
The link between antinatalism and abortion yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think David's absolutely right. It depends on your view of what's called personal identity, really, when a new being exists. And from David's point of view, we don't really exist until 28 weeks, and so that would mean it would make sense. In fact, you'd have that moral obligation to end your pregnancy before then, to prevent that child from coming into existence. So I think that would be consistent with antinatalism.
What's your actual view, though?
My actual view is the first view that David referred to, is that we have moral value from conception, and so from an antinatalist point of view, if I was an antinatalist, abortion would be impermissible from conception.
It's interesting. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Perhaps just clarify. Bruce was correct in speaking about a moral obligation to perform an abortion or have an abortion if one combined antinatalism with a sentience view. But it's quite important to distinguish that obligation from there being a legal entitlement to force people to abort.
Of course.
So it's very important about abortion to distinguish between the morality of abortion and what the law ought to say about abortion. So although I do think that in the earlier stages of gestation, people ought to be aborting, I do not think that the law ought to be forcing that on anybody.
Indeed, because in a way, I'm assuming as well that you're not in favour of laws that would prohibit procreation, in the sense that, obviously China has, for instance, adopted in the past one-child policies and so on because of population growth. Now, do you support those kinds of governmental restrictions, or do you actually think, no, we should just let people do what they want to do and it's up to their own conscience whether they choose not to have children ultimately?
Well, I think there's some government interventions that are appropriate and some that are inappropriate. So if, for example, a government were incentivizing lower birth rates, that seems to be perfectly reasonable. But if a government were forcibly sterilizing people, forcibly aborting people, that would be problematic on my view.
That's interesting. So you're open to the idea of government incentivizing, but not obviously to actually forcing people not to have children in those kinds of ways.
Yes. I mean, governments provide all kinds of incentives of different kinds. And we need to evaluate each of those incentives, first of all, in terms of what they're trying to achieve, and secondly, in terms of the permissibility of the actual incentive, and also the effectiveness of the incentive. But I've got no, in principle, opposition to incentives.
I mean, a lot of people these days are choosing to self-limit as well. So I'm thinking of that well-publicised example of Meghan Markle and Harry. I don't think I'm allowed to call them the Duke and Duchess anymore, but they said publicly that they'll limit themselves to a maximum of 2 children because of their concerns around climate change and overpopulation and so on. So does that kind of choice to have less children, does that also map onto antinatalism in your view, even if people aren't saying we won't have any, but we'll limit the number?
Yes, at the outset, I mentioned that there are different ways of interpreting antinatalism, and I think that one way in which you could use that term is to refer to a reduction in the number of beings you bring into existence. Of course, that's not anywhere as controversial as the view that we ought never to create new children. But it's not unreasonable to describe a policy or a choice as antinatalist if it merely seeks to reduce the number of children. We just need to be clear that that's what's meant.
I mean, in that sense of antinatalism, Bruce, you could argue that anyone who uses contraception is at some level an antinatalist. They're trying to reduce the number of children they're bringing into the world, even if they're allowing themselves to have a certain number. But maybe more.
That's a fair point, I think.
It's interesting. It is about those different gradations, I suppose, though, because for most people, the idea of no one reproducing so that humanity goes extinct is obviously quite a different kind of concept in that way. Well, what did you want to bring to the conversation at this point, though, Bruce? I know you had some questions yourself.
I have a couple of questions on antinatalism itself, but while we're talking about abortion, I just thought I'd ask David what he actually thinks contributes to a child's moral status. Is it kind of experiences, or just consciousness, or what would you think?
And sapient characteristics are relevant to determining how we should treat a being, but what the impact that has on how we should treat a being can vary. So sometimes, if a being has more understanding, doing something to it can be worse for that being than if it doesn't have understanding. So let's say painlessly killing a being that has long-term goals is probably worse than painlessly killing a being that only has short-term goals. But it's also the case that sometimes the cognitively more sophisticated being, because it's able to understand something, is actually harmed less than a being that understands the world less. So here's an example. Let's imagine that we had to perform, to satisfy, let's say, some terrorist demand, a dental procedure either on an ordinary adult human being, let's say an unnecessary dental procedure on an ordinary adult human being, and or we could do it on a dog. Well, it might just be far more bewildering for a dog than for a human being. A human being might understand that it's having this cavity filled, this manufactured cavity filled in order to save lives, and it might give meaning to this a person's life to be the victim, as it were. Whereas a dog would be utterly bewildered. When dogs have to have their teeth cleaned, they often have to be sedated because of how harmful it is to them. So I don't think that increased sapience, increased cognitive capacity always means that you're more protected. I just think it's relevant to how we treat you.
Yep, fair enough. That actually brings me on to a point I want to ask about your asymmetry argument. And one of your first points is that the presence of pain is bad. That's correct, isn't it?
Correct, yes.
I read a book some years ago called Pain, the Gift Nobody Wants by a doctor called Paul Brand and Philip Yancey. Now, Paul Brand was a leading medical authority on leprosy, and the book explains how leprosy destroys your nerves and leprosy patients can't feel pain. It makes it difficult to know when leprosy patients have injured themselves, and that ends up getting infections, you lose fingers and toes.
I feel like this is just going down the route of pain having instrumental value, which is a classic argument. So we'll see if that's exactly where he's going, but it feels like it's going to go down that road.
And other things. And so Paul Brand explains that pain really is a gift that lets us know when our body is injured. And so I want to know if you could perhaps comment on how that fits in with your asymmetry argument.
So I can, if someone's very new to this subject, I can kind of see how they make this mistake, but it's a very sort of basic error that's being made. So what, in David's argument, what he's saying in that pain or suffering is bad is the experience, right? This negative experience. Now, some people say that overall, all things considered, pain can be good because the negative experience, which is negative, provides some further down the line or external value, right? So like he's saying, if you lean on something really hot, this is going to cause a negative experience, something that is not nice, it's not good. But overall, it's probably good that you felt that, but even though it was a bad experience, because it's getting you to then stop leaning on that hot thing. So you're going to prevent further harm, right, to yourself. So within the context of needing some mechanism to be able to avoid negative things, right, negative external stimuli or things that may affect you negatively, we need some mechanism to do that. And the mechanism we've got, which I think is a very sloppy mechanism, is the one that evolution has equipped us with, right? I.e., our nervous system, the ability to feel pain, nociception. So yes, it provides value to us in that it helps us navigate the world, but the negative experiences in and of themselves don't seem to have positive value, right? In other words, if those negative experiences provided no other value outside of just the experience itself, would that be a positive thing to experience? It doesn't build any character. It doesn't warn you of anything. It is just, like we would call it in any other context, gratuitous suffering, right? That's the negative thing, right? Now, the positive sort of like an onion layers on top of it that we put, that Bruce is talking about, that stuff is should be taken into account and is positive once we're here, but it's not something that counts in favor of creating someone, which I believe is probably what David's going to say, or Benatar's going to say. And yeah, the reason is because all those other things that we find value in the suffering are only of value because we exist to benefit from that instrumental value. If you don't exist, you don't need to go through the suffering to get that value. So to give an example, if you're here and you say go to the gym and go through some, modest amount of suffering to get the benefits, like grow stronger, be more competent physically, obviously that's good for you. There's other health benefits. But to say that you're going to create someone so that they can go to the gym and benefit from going to the gym makes no sense, because they don't exist to need the benefits, right? And they're going to go through the suffering. So yeah, this is the, it's a classic sort of misunderstanding, but it's a good one to flesh out, because it helps people to understand where antinatalists are coming from.
Because I can't see that the presence of pain is always bad. In fact, maybe most of the time the presence of pain is informative and tells us that there's something wrong.
That's more of an empirical rather than conceptual thing he's getting into there, which I actually disagree with. I think the vast majority of suffering that goes on is completely gratuitous. Like, it doesn't serve any purpose. We don't benefit from it in any way, especially when you're taking into account non-human animals. A lot of the pain they will go through is completely gratuitous, and they may not even have the cognitive capacity to use that as some form of medium for transformation.
That's a common optimistic move, but I think it misunderstands my position. So I'm not denying pain sometimes has instrumental value.
Right.
It can do. I'm saying it's intrinsically bad.
Okay.
And if you're considering whether to bring a being into existence, it doesn't need any of the instrumental value of pain if it doesn't come into existence.
Right, okay.
So you can either create this being or not. If you do create it, the pain will be intrinsically bad for it. There might be some extrinsic or instrumental benefits, but those are not things that you're losing out on if you don't create the being in the first place.
Okay, so even though it's instrumentally good, if you don't have the being at all, then there's no pain at all, and so you haven't harmed a being. That's what you're saying.
I was going to ask a similar.
It's a comment from Heartborn in the chat. Suffering is like a black hole. You're always going to fall into it if you're a sentient being, which is very depressingly true.
Sort of question, which is, I often think of, it's not quite so simple as saying, well, let's just look at the pain versus the pleasure, if you like, in a very utilitarian way. Because often, there's a part of the value of something is the effort and the pain and the stress that it took to get it. A great instrumentalist probably has to go through a great deal of pain of a sort in, being frustrated as they try to learn the instrument and having to put in a lot of hours and hard work and so on. But there's a great value at the end of that, of the pleasure it brings and the value of being able to create music and so on. And that would apply to many things in life, wouldn't it? Now, do you say that, you recognise that some pains aren't necessarily bad in that sense if they contribute to some greater good, but that you don't think we need to worry about any of that in the case of someone who simply never had the opportunity to have any of those experiences? Because part of me wonders, maybe there is ultimately a value to having those experiences if we let that life exist, that it would be better for that life to exist and have those experiences, albeit there being some pain in the process.
But why? That's the reason. Like, why? I understand he's not the one being interviewed, but he hasn't even given some sort of vague sort of reason that we can latch onto.
Well, two things. So first of all, I think that this is all reducible to pleasure and pain. When I speak in the book about pleasure and pain, I'm really just using those as exemplars of benefits and harms more generally. That's the first point. The second point is that the response I gave to Bruce, I think, also would apply to your point, Justin. So you're citing instances where either pain or hardship or stress is instrumentally valuable, and nothing in my argument denies that it can be instrumentally valuable. All the argument says is that we don't need those instruments. There's no net gain to having those instruments if the alternative is not bringing the person into existence.
Okay, so if I can clarify then, even if one had kind of the perfect life but experienced pain just for a very short period, Your argument basically says that we would be better off not bringing that person into existence, doesn't it?
Not quite. So
Not
there's
quite.
a distinction I want to draw between whether the coming into existence is a benefit or a harm to the being who's brought into existence, and whether we ought not to create the being.
Yep.
So let's imagine some hypothetical.
Yeah, and this is why Benatar talks about how his axiological asymmetry argument in the real world isn't all you need to get to the antinatalist conclusion. You need to understand whether that being is going to experience suffering or not, right? Obviously, people can conjure up a hypothetical about a being that never suffers, then you can be indifferent as to whether they're created. But in the real world, there's always going to be suffering, and in the world we live in, it's always going to be a significant amount. And that's the thing that generates the antinatalist conclusion.
Scenario where there was only a minuscule amount of harm in some potential person's life. And now I can say of that case that coming into existence would be a harm to that person, but a very minuscule harm. And that's a harm that might well be outweighed by other considerations, including perhaps the parental interest in creating that child.
Okay.
So there are two different questions. The one is about whether a being is harmed, and the other is about whether we ought not to bring a being into existence. And the first one doesn't entail the second one.
Okay, so basically, sorry.
Sorry, you go.
So basically, you're saying some degree of harm could be justified if the benefits are sufficient enough.
Well, I'm thinking if the harms were limited enough, then it might be that they could be outweighed by other considerations. But I don't think the actual world is like that at all. I think in the actual world, the harms that are attendant upon existence are just so great that it would be indecent to think that could be outweighed by other considerations, such as a parent creating that being.
And yet I'm aware that most people, even those who undergo great difficulty and pain in life, it's relatively rare for people to wish that they had never been born. People seem to want nonetheless to exist and for the possibility that life will get better and to struggle through some of those difficulties. That seems to be our natural human status. So how does that map on then to your argument here, David? If the fact is most people, most of the time, don't, even in the midst of hardship, still don't go to the level of saying, I wish I hadn't been born. Does that make any difference?
Yeah, I think most people can be wrong. Most people in a desert, under particular circumstances, will see a mirage. That doesn't mean to say they're rarely seeing water. If you think about the Lier-Muller effect, that will be manifest in most people, but it doesn't mean to say that you're getting a veridical perception of the way the world actually is. So just because something is widespread doesn't mean to say it's true. If we can give a very good explanation for why you are going to be systematically misled about something or systematically misjudge something, then we ought to give that some credence.
Actually, I do have a question on that. Why do you think self-assessments of one's quality of life are unreliable? I mean, from one point of view, we can agree they are. People tend to be optimistic, don't they? I think there's plenty of studies that show that. But why isn't someone's own personal assessment of their life what we should be considering anyway? What does it matter that objectively maybe their life is not as good as they think it is, as long as they enjoy and think their life is one of a certain quality that they enjoy? I'm not sure why you think the objective side of things matters for them.
And there's two things to say here. Like, there's one question as to whether someone's judgment of their own life is reliable. The second is whether, even if it is reliable, is one's judgment of one's own life something that can justify or inform creating others, i.e., I've had a good life, I know I've judged that accurately, and so I'm going to use that to inform creating someone else because, they will have a good life. Which, there's so many issues just with that. Even if we remove any ambiguity around whether people are accurate in the judgments they make about their own lives, even if you say, right, fine, they are completely accurate, there's still a massive gap between that, with people accurately judging their own lives to be good, and using that to inform creating others. But yeah, let's see what Benatar says on this one.
I think it depends on what decision you're making. So if you're talking about an existing person who's deciding whether or not to continue their life, let's say they're suffering a terminal condition, there's unbearable suffering associated with this, and then you may get two people who go in different directions. One says, well, I'm prepared to put up with this. This is better than death. And somebody else might say, well, I'd rather be dead. Right. And yeah, I'm exactly inclined to defer to the person whose life it is, because if they're mistaken, they're going to be the person who is going to pay the price. So I don't think it's right for us to be imposing an external decision on them. But that's not the decision we're talking about when we're speaking about procreation. Now we're deciding whether to bring a being into existence. And we can't consult that being. That's impossible. So we've got to decide for it. Now, let's imagine that you could create a slave, create a being that would be a slave to you, and you could create it in such a way that would actually endorse its enslaved condition. You know that one of the features of creating it is that it would endorse its status as a slave.
Right. So you're saying that self-assessment would be wrong.
We wouldn't just defer to self-assessment there. We wouldn't say, well, I'm going to be creating a happy slave, a contented slave, and therefore it's expected to do that, especially if there was some systematic explanation for why the slave, let's say, would have that adaptive preference.
Very interesting.
Yes, it is. It raises all kinds of interesting sort of thought experiments, doesn't it, doing this? I mean, another, though, practical implication of this, I suppose something that I worry about a bit with the antinatalist philosophy is whether it would encourage, let's say, people who maybe suffer from mental health issues and so on, to kind of grab onto this philosophy and say, well, here's a justification for me ending my life, and rather than, you know, and under normal circumstances we would encourage most people to seek help, counselling, whatever, medical intervention, to stop them going down that route. Is there a danger that antinatalism kind of confirms people in their suicidal tendencies and that sort of thing, David?
Well, let's be clear. Antinatalism is different from what's sometimes called pro-mortalism. So you can think that it is harm to come into existence without being committed to the idea that it's better to cease to exist. And so anybody who's wanting to use antinatalism for their pro-mortalist ideas is misunderstanding the relationship between those two ideas. Now, I do think that we need to have more serious reflection on when it is the case that life cease to be in somebody's interest, all things considered. So although I think that death is a harm, and it is bad for the person who dies, I do believe also that there are other harms that are attendant on continued existence, and sometimes it is a choice between two different evils, and you've got to choose the lesser of the two evils. And I think we need to have much more discussion about when death is the lesser of two evils.
Sure. And that's obviously a live discussion here. I'm sure probably in South Africa, you know, issues around assisted suicide and so on, when what the circumstances of that should be when we allow someone to effectively take their life if they feel their quality of life is no longer livable. Is that an area where you would like to see more liberalisation because you feel people should have more control over when they choose to end their life?
I do think there should be more liberalisation of the law there. Obviously, we need to have some safeguards. We don't want people with mental diseases, mental disorders, especially ones that are curable, from just rushing off and killing themselves. There needs to be some kind of safeguard against that. But I think there are many people who quite reasonably decide that it's not in their interest to continue living. And I think they ought to have more scope for making that choice. So just as I am pro-choice on the abortion question, even when I think that people do wrong in continuing a pregnancy, so I think there ought to be more scope for choice here, because I don't believe that the government should be the final arbiter on all these matters and be intruding in people's lives in these matters when there are serious costs to the government doing so.
What's your view on that? Obviously, it takes us to the other end of life,
it does.
rather than abortion, Bruce.
It is.
But yeah,
it's an interesting discussion, and normally, if you get involved in discussions about euthanasia, whether voluntary or not, you come up against people who can give a very concrete example of a beloved parent or someone like that who's died in a great deal of pain, and we have to be very careful not to make hasty judgments there. I think in terms of euthanasia, David alluded to that there are dangers associated with it, and from a practical point of view, I think that's my main concern with euthanasia. I don't know that it's possible to legislate for euthanasia without having the possibility that people will be killed unnecessarily and possibly against their will. And I think David mentioned people who are mentally ill, and that already is happening in places like Belgium, only in a small number of cases, but I think the slippery slope really is real when it comes to euthanasia, and we have to be extremely cautious if we're thinking about endorsing it.
I mean, David, rightly says we mustn't confuse antinatalism with promortalism.
Yeah.
Is there a danger it will inevitably be confused, though, by people who, in your view, Bruce, might sort of latch onto this?
I think you can use some of the arguments about quality of life in that way. So I agree. I mean, David, I think it talks about there's a different bar between whether we should create a life, and that's a different question to whether a life should continue. And yeah, that kind of makes sense there. But I think it is easy to confuse discussions about people's...
I get the impression that Bruce is actually pretty sympathetic to antinatalism after reviewing whatever he's reviewed. But maybe there's a mixture of, there's still this attachment to his religious beliefs. And also, I think his intuitions are being pulled in different directions, I think. But yeah, it would be interesting to hear his reflections back on this debate and whether any of it has sort of been left with him, has lasted.
Quality of life, and then go on to, well, maybe their quality of life isn't good enough and we should offer them the option to end it. And I think that's, from a purely practical point of view, without talking about Christianity, I think it's a really dangerous thing to do. As a Christian, I'm even more cautious.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, David.
So I think it's possible for somebody to misinterpret antinatalism, but it's possible for somebody to misinterpret any number of views, including Christianity. So you get people who do appalling things in the name of Christianity. There's no guarantee that any view is not going to be distorted by somebody who is prone to distortion or somebody who's willfully trying to distort. And so I don't think we should be rejecting any view on the basis of that. I think we need to look carefully and evaluate views on their merits and try to encourage more rigorous thinking about any particular view rather than sloppy thinking about it.
Yeah, I think I agree. Can I ask a question about Christianity then?
Well, why don't we do that on the other side of a quick break?
Okay.
Because we're already butting up against our next break, and I would like it to come back to the issues around Christianity and atheism and how this ties in. As David has said, he doesn't think it necessarily splits down particularly theistic or atheistic lines, but I think there's a few more questions to be asked around that. So we'll go to our break. This is Justin Briley with Unbelievable, bringing you a philosophical discussion on quite an unusual topic today, antinatalism. My guests are David Benatar and Bruce Blackshaw. Really interesting philosophical discussion on the show today, asking, should we let humans go extinct? David Benatar and Bruce Blackshaw are my guests, talking about antinatalism on the programme today. I will make sure there are links to both my guests from today's show page over at premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. You might want to check out David's book there, Better Never to Have Been, and Bruce's blog is called philosophicalapologist.com. Before we went to our break, though, Bruce, I think you were hoping to lob a question in on, in relation to Christianity.
Sure. I guess I wanted to ask David, hypothetically, what difference does Christianity make to the antenatal calculus? So I noticed in one of your book, probably in your most recent book, if I can quote you, you say, it would indeed be wonderful if there were a beneficent God who'd created us for good reason and who cared for us as a loving parent would for his or her children. Now, let's think for a moment that that is the case, which is what I do believe. How does that affect the antinatalist point of view?
Well, as I suggested earlier, I don't think that it necessarily affects the view. So what the part you've quoted is not a premise. I think it's a conclusion. It's a conclusion of an observation about a world that is replete with suffering, not just suffering that is caused by humans and that falls humans, but just think about the vast amount of suffering in the natural world among animals that are predated upon, that die of starvation and disease. There are just billions of these animals that are suffering. Yeah,
and it's interesting to see there's been more discourse around the suffering of wild animals in the problem of evil as an argument against certain gods, that are claimed to be benevolent. And you get people like Alex O'Connor, Stephen, what's his name, Stephen Woodford, the rationality rules, and a few other people, and that's kind of interesting to see. And I think antinatalism would add like an additional quiver to the bow of the argument from evil.
And when I look at a world like that, the conclusion that I draw is that it could not have been created by an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent being. So I think the atheist conclusion is not, it's not a premise in the antinatalist argument. It's a conclusion of another argument.
No, I understand that. I'm just saying, if we take for a moment that the Christian view was true, how does that make a difference in, I'm thinking in terms of a life that has a little bit of harm but is an almost perfect life? If we extrapolate to a life of, say, 80 years long, and the Christian view of an eternal life with God forever after, does that perspective of a very short life here on earth and eternal life with God make any difference to that calculus?
Well, on one hand, I can see how it make a difference. I think that's exactly why people postulate an afterlife, because it's just so unacceptable and so abhorrent that we would live for such a short period of time. But one way to deny our mortality is to assume an afterlife in an incorporeal, immortal form. So I can understand exactly what the attraction is there. I think it does make the lot or the human predicament look less bad than it otherwise would be. The question for me is whether that's a reason to accept it. And it sounds to me like wishful thinking.
I think that's a fair assessment, that if that's the only reason we're postulating God and eternal life is to get around this conclusion, yeah, it is wishful thinking. I mean, that's not the only reason I believe in God, of course, but yeah.
But we probably won't have time to
get into that.
To dig into the reasons you do obviously believe in God and Christianity today. I mean, in a sense, I'm interested in kind of, as we start to draw the show to a close here, David. I mentioned earlier that I think I've come to see, in the same way that Bruce has actually, that antinatalism is quite a logically consistent outworking of a kind of atheistic, naturalistic point of view. And I can see why a lot of my friends who are atheists, I will probably be saying, well, have you considered being an antinatalist? Because it kind of makes sense, actually, on if you're a vegan, for instance, and you really believe in the kind of balance of ethical balances, you should probably be an antinatalist as well. It's a kind of a logical next step in a way. Now, as a Christian, the reason I'm not an antinatalist is because I do believe that there's something extra about life that is imbued by God with inherent value that makes it worth having, even at the cost of some of the potential suffering that exists and so on. I mean, does the fact, I suppose...
I wonder... Well, I guess sometimes they do that, but I wonder if Justin would say, that's kind of easy to say for him, right? But if you come across someone who is suffering abhorrently, and you're to say to them, it's horrible that you're suffering, but don't worry, because God has imbued some sort of value in you that makes your, all things considered, it was good that you came into existence. That to me just seems so gratuitous and indecent to say that. I mean, the thing is, the reason I see it like that is because I'm not a Christian, I'm an atheist. So it's easy for me to say that, because in Justin's worldview, he would say, well, if this person is suffering a lot and they think, that is a reason that it would have been better if they never came into existence, well, they're just mistaken about that. Like how earlier Benatar was saying how most people are actually mistaken to be happy that they came into existence. So the point I'm making is really not it's not a counter argument. It's just my personal repulsion to that sort of, in what I see, belittling of the suffering of others. And I know Justin wouldn't, I'm sure in real life he wouldn't actually go up to someone who's suffering greatly and say these things. But it's just the mindset. In my mind, I would just look at the suffering and I would just be like, well, that's just fucked. This person didn't choose to come into existence. They didn't choose the hand they were dealt when they came into existence. you know, and they're another victim of existence, and it's tragic. Yeah, it's just very different worldviews.
I want to challenge you with this a little bit, David. Does the fact that most people, Christian or not, struggle, I think, intuitively with the antinatalist philosophy, with the conclusion, could it suggest that the naturalist worldview, that naturalist worldview, might itself be cast into doubt if we find it so difficult to accept the consequences, of antinatalism? Could it mean that actually it suggests there is actually an intrinsic value to life that maybe we haven't given credence to if we're an atheist?
I don't think so. I think it's precisely because the conditions are so bad that people enter into a state of denial. And I don't think that is the preserve of theists. I think it applies equally to atheists, as you've acknowledged in some circumstances.
Lucas Sanders has just messaged in the chat saying, is this going to be uploaded to my channel, available to watch later? Yes, it is. Once the live is finished, it will stay on the live tab, so you can just go back to the live tab in your own time and watch this back all the way from the beginning. So yeah, don't feel like you have to watch it all live to be able to actually see it all.
You'll obviously be familiar with Richard Dawkins and his God delusion. Well, I've written about an optimism delusion, and I think the optimism delusion cuts across both theists and atheists. I think the human predicament is a really awful predicament, and people, whether they are theistically inclined or atheistically inclined, are resistant to recognizing it for what it is, and so they desperately find some kind of coping mechanism.
It's super interesting, because in a way you're kind of being incredibly honest about the reality of life in a kind of godless universe, in a way that for me I think is grasping the nettle in that sense.
Yeah, but you're suggesting that this is a problem just for atheists and naturalists, and what I'm suggesting is that you can get two kinds of optimism delusion in response to that. The one is a naturalistic one that tries to extol all the benefits of existence, that tries to deny the sorts of asymmetry that I speak about. In other words, it's an optimism that is devoid of any theistic content. But the other way to do it is to opt for a theistic view and all its features that make the predicament easier to accept. So sure. I don't think this is a difficulty uniquely for naturalists. I think you're getting two manifestations of an optimism delusion.
Well, be interested in your final thoughts as we start to draw this to a close as well, Bruce.
Well, I can see how David would think that way if that was the only reason we believed in God, and I'm sure from his point of view he probably thinks the origin of religious belief comes from that kind of motivation. Yeah, that's one we can't really explore in any further detail here, I guess.
You just have to leave it that you do have other reasons why you do believe.
There are plenty of other reasons I believe. I've got a quote here from C.S. Lewis. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And I think that sums up my view of Christianity, that it has the most explanatory power of any view that I'm aware of.
And will consequently change the way you look at something like an argument for antinatalism.
Absolutely, yeah.
Obviously, we're not going to have time to dig into the deeper depths of why you obviously both take very different views on as atheists and Christian on that. But obviously, acknowledge that your starting point will make a difference to how you weigh up the cost and the benefit of life and so on. I've really enjoyed this, actually, as much as it's a sort of serious, potentially even depressing topic. Actually, I've enjoyed kind of putting it through the rigorous philosophical mill today on the show, and I've thought both of your contributions very gracious towards each other as well. So, David, any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with as we finish today's show?
I don't think it's time for us to probe this in much more detail, but I have enjoyed the conversation, so thank you to both of you.
Thank you very much. And Bruce, thanks for coming in.
Thank you, David. Kudos to you. You've developed a very interesting argument that people find difficult to refute. So,
yeah, absolutely. On a naturalistic basis, as we say, it feels like there's a lot to it there. We will leave it there. Well, today on the show,
and that is it. So let me get that out of the way. So that is that was the discussion between Bruce Blackshaw and David Benatar. I hope everyone enjoyed it. So yeah, my overall thoughts were that I need to go away and understand religious antinatalism more, which is going to be a long process because there's a lot of it out there. You know, like if you're understanding antinatalism from more of a secular understanding, there are variations, but maybe I'm being ignorant here, but it just seems like the variations in understanding the world within religion are just so much more diverse. There's just so many different religions, and many of them will have different ways of seeing the world that are relevant to antinatalism. You then have to consider, all of them. And I was going to mention as well, but which is why I laughed, but Heartborn puts in the chat specifically on a naturalistic basis, as if Benatar hadn't consistently made the point that the watershed is not between theism and atheism, it's between antinatalists and non-antinatalists and optimists, right? And he explained that like 3 or 4 times, and then right at the end there, Justin goes, yeah, specifically on a materialist naturalistic basis. Which whatever. But that was a good one. And if people want more Benatar, then interview coming out soon. It will be out hopefully on Sunday. We will have to see if the issue is resolved. Hopefully it will be. It's not a major issue. It's just, it would be really nice to have it solved before putting it out. So that will be out soon. Thank you everyone for joining. Let me know via email if there's anything else you want to see in a live stream. I will put those links in the description, and I will see everyone in the next one.